black agents. Did you feel America was under siege from drugs, or was it just a job for you? Is it something that you feel called, I need to do this, America's under siege, or hey, this is just a job opportunity?
Okay, well, when I graduated from, are we rolling? When I graduated from college, I had an interview with the U.S. Secret Service, who at that time was not hiring any black agents. And so I went with Compton, California Police Department and found that Compton was a real den of criminals with a large homicide, robbery, major felony area. And I stayed there for 4 years, and I saw the city, a lot of the would-be teens getting into gangs, and the gangs had no way of obtaining any type of employment, so they started to selling drugs. They began to sell drugs because that was the only viable means of employment other than McDonald's, Burger King, and those places who only hired a few teenagers.
Industrial jobs were going away.
They were gone. And not only that, but a lot of the teens in the Compton area include mostly blacks, some whites, Hispanic, and Japanese, were not privy to those jobs. So they ended up finding employment in the drug business. And in that area, we had drug dealers, we had slingers, we had people who today are called neighborhood pharmacists, medicine men, and the drugstore men. And these are people who have ventured into the drug business. And in reality, they have hired a number of people. Some are runners and some are sub-dealers as well. Some are mules. Some of the young dealers are the ones who go down to the border.
So they're an important part of the economy.
Without question, yes.
Can you say what I...
Yeah, the drug business is a very important part of the economy, and there is a drug economy out there where the druggies use what is called supplemental nutritional program called SNAP cards as a means of exchange, medium of exchange as money. The food stamp, they trade these SNAP cards and food stamps for monetary gain, usually given only 50% or sometimes 60% per dollar on the dollar. Along with that came a lot of crimes involving murder, arson, burglaries, shoplifting, window smashing, all kinds of crimes of violence and crimes against properties.
So what year were you tapped? So take us to when you go to B&DD.
I stayed in Compton until 1969, and I saw that.
You were there right as the riot. So in '66 there wasn't that much drug use, and in just those couple of years it went from marijuana was probably rare to drugs are everywhere.
Right. Well, actually, I started on the police department during the infamous 1965 Watts riot. And I was on the department at that time and had not completed the police academy. And
did you see the drug use go up after the riot?
After the riot, I saw the drug use escalate. I saw not only, in those days we had pills, uppers and downers, dextroamphetamine sulfate, and the secanols, reds, and the tuanols, reds and blues, uppers and downers. Then I saw marijuana, which was prevalent, but not such a large scale. And then there came an immersion of the heroin into the market. And in Compton, we had a few heroin addicts, and then we had heroin addicts in a bordering area of Los Angeles called the Front, Imperial and Wilmington, where guys would come down into Compton to commit crimes to support their drug habits. And the medicine men were saturated, concentrated in that area called the Front, Imperial Central, between 108th and 115th Street on Wilmington Avenue, the Front.
So comparing what you saw, the impact of LSD versus heroin, cocaine, and marijuana, what was the most, at that time, what seemed like the most dangerous drug?
At that time, LSD had just emerged, and at that time we saw a lot of but LSD was in the white community, and not many blacks were using any of the hallucinogenic drugs. We saw the whites using LSD, and in the process of becoming, being diagnosed as being mentally incompetent and being housed or ordered into mental institutions. Many of these people were young adults whose minds were twisted from the use of LSD.
So that's not just a myth. You personally saw it.
I saw it, yes, and we had hospitals in the Los Angeles General Hospital. We had the hospital out at Camarillo. We had one out in Norwalk, which was a mental treatment facility. At that same time, back in 1969, we had a television personality by the name of Art Linkletter, and his son bailed out of a window out of him.
Daughter?
Pardon?
Was it his daughter?
Daughter bailed out of a window in New York thinking that she could fly. And it was at that time it was determined that LSD was a tremendously debilitating drug. Contemporaneous to that time, we had in Harlem and many of the major cities that had heavy black population, a lot of heroin. There were heroin addicts in New York that were on the nod. They were falling out, dying of overdose. And we had an impact of heroin. At that time, we had white heroin was coming in from Europe out of France, and then we started getting brown heroin coming in out of Mexico. Then shortly...
What was the ratio? Did it seem like there was more, or depending on what part of the country you were in?
It depended. The East Coast mostly had the white heroin because they were getting heroin from Europe. And then we had the brown heroin that was coming from Mexico. LA and up to the Midwest, and which initially was called Mexican mud. And then we started, this was during the time of the Vietnam War, and we had a surge of white heroin coming in from what was called the Golden Triangle, Burma, Laos, and Thailand. And at that time, I saw an erosion of many of the communities, and students who were deemed to be successful fall into the prey of these drugs. And I decided to leave Compton Police Department and went with an agency called the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. I put in an application, and this was about the time when Art Linkletter's daughter committed suicide.
So it wasn't just a job. You had a personal feeling like, hey, I want to make this my career, drugs are...
Yes, I wanted to make a difference. I saw the country going to hell in a basket, to say. I saw people just destroying their lives. I saw heroin addicts going to noted families' residence, and when a member of the family would come up, the family would say, go hide everything. You would be at a function like a picnic or a cookout barbecue, and when a member of the family, a friend came that was a heroin addict, the people would say, go and hide everything, cameras and everything of value, purses, and because they knew that when that heroin addict came on the premises that something was going to be stolen. But I went with the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, which was the predecessor to the Drug Enforcement Administration. And at that time, we were seeing a lot of pills being manufactured in the United States and sent down to Mexico and sent back up to the United States. I did a case that is perhaps even today one of the largest undercover seizure of many bennies, dextroamphetamine sulfate, which was 2 million in an undercover capacity.
It's a
Downer. No, it's an upper. Upper, yeah.
Oh, it's an amphetamine.
Amphetamine, it's an upper. And at that time, we had a number of truck drivers were taking amphetamines, and a lot of people in various occupations were taking them. We had the musicians, we had a lot of people who were in the music life or the movie stars, they were taking it as well.
Over the long term, having worked in different cities over many decades, what was, if maybe there's not an answer to this, but what's the most damaging of all the major illegal drugs? Is it heroin or, because you can be a 30-year, 40-year.
I think over a period of time, let me go back to when Art Linkletter's daughter was committed suicide. At that time, the consensus was that drugs were in the black community and they were unmanageable. So as a consequence, nothing very much was done. And as a result, we had even law enforcement officers involved because nobody really cared about anything.
Especially in New York.
In New York, as a matter of fact, New York was so rife with officers being involved in 1970 after I had gone on to the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. Because of my undercover prowess, I was selected to go back and work on a Governor Mayor Lenz's task force, which was
The NAP commission, right?
NAP commission, yes, and it was to work undercover on police officers in New York who were involved in the drug trade, those who was actually trafficking in drugs.
You worked there.
But at that time, I didn't go because I had, my wife was pregnant. But I know agents who went, one of the agents who went in my stead worked on a case that ended up in a movie called Batman and Robin. He worked on those two guys that they were two policemen who were very corrupt. And they had a movie about it called Batman and Robin were the main characters. But getting back to, in the early 70s, the white heroin was coming into the United States, and it was being shipped into the United States in Cannabis. We had a major trafficker, two major traffickers involved. One was Leslie Atkins, and the other one was Herman Jackson. And reportedly, both had a club over in Thailand, in Bangkok, Thailand. But on one occasion, I was negotiating for a kilogram of white heroin up in, out of all places, Bakersfield, California. I went up to Bakersfield and I had a wisdom tooth extracted, so I was in deep pain at the time. And I worked undercover and I ordered a kilogram of white heroin from a guy by the name of Eli Homer Hamilton. And he told me to stand by for a couple of days, so I stayed in the hotel for a couple of days. And of course, I had surveillance all over the place. And after 2 days arrived, he and his cohort delivered a kilogram of white heroin to me. And I thought it was a burn because it was almost like flour. And when I put it in the cobalt thiocyanate test tube, it immediately turned purple, which was an indication that it was heroin. And when we sent it to the lab, I was at my desk and I got a telephone call from the chemist telling me that it was 100% pure.
So there was a big, as the Vietnam War geared up, there was a big uptick in availability and quality of heroin.
Of heroin, this is true.
Can you say that in a sentence?
When the Vietnam War was in progress, there was a big availability of heroin, white heroin that was purer than the heroin that was coming in from Europe and from Mexico. The heroin from Europe and Mexico generally had been diluted quite a bit. But in the Vietnam era, the heroin was coming over that was very, very pure. And one of the rock groups wrote a song called Chasing the Dragon. And not many people realized what they were talking about. And that was actually smoking white heroin on aluminum foil and inhaling it through a straw. And that's what is called smoking the dragon. And we started seeing people being killed because of the purity of the white heroin. But the Leslie Atkins and Herman Jackson, they were major violators
Out of North Carolina.
out of North Carolina, and they were probably the predecessors to guys like Frank Matthews and the other major narcotic traffickers in the New York area.
Yeah, I met Ike Atkinson when he got in trouble in prison.
Who did?
Atkinson would have only done 9 years back in the 70s. He got 2 more conspiracy cases from inside prison. He was trying to do deals from in prison.
Right.
But he was living on his military thing. He did 20 years in the military.
And good pension, yeah.
Weird.
It is, it is not unusual for drug trafficking. It's been my experience that drug trafficking is similar to drug addiction, is that the trafficker makes so much money and so easily with so little effort
Hard to stop.
that it's hard to stop. It's the same premise that happens in many of the neighborhoods throughout the United States. And I think we, even today, and I think we are at a loss, we are in denial that in the United States there's drugs all over the place. And I would postulate with a degree of certainty that many of the crimes that are committed in many of these cities are drug related, not necessarily over territories. Many of them involves drugs that were shorted, drugs that were bad drugs. Even here in Little Rock, the guys are learning to burn people with a drug they call Suflex. It's something that looks like drugs. And this has been a trend that has happened for a long period of time. Even when I was out there working undercover, we had the traffickers to test your identity. Sometimes they would burn you the first time by giving you a bogus package to determine if the jump out guys, they would call the undercover surveillance agents, would arrest them. And some would sell bogus drugs for the money if they thought you were a novice. And so the federal law came around where they made it a federal law to sell something in lieu of.
It was just like selling the real drugs.
The real drugs, right.
So now that there's always been conspiracy theories about drugs were purposely put to destroy certain groups, especially in the black community, and they were treated as kind of crazy conspiracy theories. But now in these last 10 years or so, we've had CIA release documents admitting that, oh well, we did help certain cocaine smugglers in the 80s. We did work with La Cosa Nostra after World War II to fight communism, and in return, we turned a blind eye to heroin. So, what do you worked for the government, and we now know that some of these conspiracy theories are at least partially true. What do you feel about, and then we also, we put so many people in prison because of drugs, mostly black males. Did the ends of slowing down drugs justify the means of putting millions of people in prison? And what do you think about the government's role in simultaneously fighting drugs with people like you, but at the other hand, they're the ones help bringing them in?
Well, actually, during the Reagan administration, this was very prolific. And the Contra support, there was a person under Reagan's administration who was a major cocaine trafficker. And I'm convinced that they sold drugs, specifically crack cocaine, and in the minority communities for monies to fund the countries. And I know that Maxine Waters had a hearing at one time probing that, and not much came out of it.
Then 10 years later, they kind of admitted it was true, but they let it die down.
They let it die down. But it's true that they did that. And I think some of the things that this particular agency did, if it were done by other agencies or employees, certainly they would be jailed. But we have to understand that in the United States, we have things that is called classified. When certain things are classified, secret, top secret, and beyond, like secret compartmental information, talent key, gamma, umbra. With those classification, federal law and federal procedures dictate that rather than get into that sensitive areas that the courts and the prosecutors must not go forward with the case. It was known that back in the 60s that the U.S. government tested U.S. soldiers with LSD. And I suspect that.
What does that make you feel personally? Like, no, you didn't know that then going on, but now looking back at your career, you say, well, gee, while I was out arresting people for doing this stuff, part of the reason there was such an uptick in availability was there was other government agencies. What do you think is just the nature of the beast?
No, you know, when I was in Germany in 1962, and I had information regarding the effects of LSD, the hot flashes and stuff like that. And I experienced some of those, and I suspected that I had been clandestinely given LSD. And I went to the doctor, and I asked the doctor, and I explained to him what was transpiring, and his explanation to me was that that I came from a Mediterranean type climate. He's talking about California, long, hot summers, short, dry winters. That it was my reaction to Germany, which at the time had the coldest winter it had had in 100 years. But even today, and I have since at one time wrote the Veterans Administration for my health records to determine if there was any information in there. And I knew when I wrote, I did get a response, got my health records back, but I knew that it would not be in there because I know some of the things that other agencies of the United States does, sometimes they will not be disclosed and cannot be disclosed because of their classification.
How does that make you feel?
Well, I think I was disappointed, but I am an American citizen, and every morning I wake up and rejoice for living in the United States. And I do that because I've seen places where I've been, like in Thailand. I've seen a man hit by a truck and died, and ironically, the spectators ran over there, and I thought it was, when I first saw it, I thought it was very humane. They were running over there, and I learned from a tuk-tuk driver that instead of rendering aid to that man, they were asking him for the lottery number. They thought that a person dying would have the lottery number. But beyond that, I had a chance with DEA. At one time, I reviewed a file where one of our agents killed a person in an accident. And it's customary that the driver of the vehicle settles with the family on the scene or shortly thereafter. And I was surprised that some settlements are like $500, $600 to $1,200 for a person's life. I found that to be interesting. But then also I found in Mexico, while working down there, there's a tremendous amount of corruption. And I know that when I was a police officer, one of the reasons I left the police department was because there was a trend to charge policemen who make honest mistakes in judgment. And there was a case where an alarm went off, and an officer shot a kid coming out of a store with a package. He had cookies and stuff, and he told the kid had a gun too, and he told him to freeze, and the kid turned around, the officer shot him with the shotgun, and the coroner's inquest came back, and it was marginal that he was not indicted. But I found that life in Mexico, and like when we kill someone in the United States, when a policeman kills someone, it's law enforcement policy to put that officer on administrative leave. One of the reasons for that is to test the officers to make sure that he gets the proper treatment, because when you kill someone, there's a tremendous amount of shock that you go through, and they know that they try to determine whether he needs assistance or clinician help to undergo that shock. And sometimes people who witness it, like his partner, also will go through this shock. But in Mexico, the federales have the authorities to kill a person And they justified by saying he disrespected the Mexican flag. And there's no coroner's inquest, none of this, writing this report and all of that. It's just that he disrespected the Mexican flag.
So what you're saying is that while even knowing what went on, you feel the ends just justify?
I say that the ends justify the means. I say that even though I didn't approve of it, and I say that I know that even today, I think we're naive not to know that a lot of things transpire all over the world at the U.S. behest, under the U.S. guidance. But I think that I'm blessed. We are blessed to be here in the United States enjoying all of the niceties that we enjoy. Give an example in Haiti. I was in Haiti several times, and I know the Haitians there, that how poor that country is. I've seen, like Mexico, parts of Mexico, how poor those countries are. How people in Mexico and certain parts of the world take little kids and they put these kids out, to beg and to make prostitute out of them at very young age. Some of them are sold, and some of these young kids are actually killed, and that's the nature of the beast. So in the United States, we have laws and we have mechanisms against that sort of thing, even though we miss a lot. But I do say that I was disappointed that many states have legalized marijuana, and I think the worst part of that is that they are allowing street guys to grow marijuana. And marijuana, back in the 60s, the smokers of marijuana was smoking, it had a tetrahydrocannabinol, a THC content of about 3%. And when a smoker got some that had 5%, they called it the death wish. It was very strong. But we had a guy over in The Hague who put together a kind of marijuana that has a tremendous high THC content. And a lot of growers now are growing it hydroponically inside of garages and places. And the then they have that Sinsemilla marijuana. And what they do with that, they grow mostly, you have a male and female plant of marijuana. They'll have the female plant in there, a whole bunch of female plants in a grow location. And over a period of time, several times a week, they would just bring in a male plant for the reaction of the females, and it activates the females, and they produce high THC content. So the marijuana that the kids are smoking today is very high. Not only that, but they, believe it or not, they're soaking it in formaldehyde. They're soaking it in PCP and all of that sort of stuff. And they have drugs out there now, scopolamine.
Yeah.
That's
I don't know if
angel's.
it's come up to the U.S. yet.
Yeah, it is in the U.S. It's called angel's breath. Scopolamine.
breath.
Right.
Devil's breath.
Devil's breath. Right. And what they can do is just blow it into a person's.
Like a zombie.
Yeah. And that's out there. There are other drugs that Americans have experimenting with. Some of these are bath preparations. Well, I won't say what they are, and some of them are eye preparations. I don't want to let those novices out there know that this is some way that you can get high.
Let's go back to late 60s. So you did some pretty interesting stuff. You worked tell us about working Sonny Liston.
I worked Sonny Liston in Las Vegas. He was dealing cocaine at a hotel called the International Hotel. They're one of the tallest buildings at the time. And he would deal around the Keno area there. He would stay there all day dealing, just personal use amount. And if someone wanted a half an ounce, it was reported that he was a connect for a number of the Hollywood stars as well for their cocaine.
So you were sent in?
Yeah, and I went there. It was funny because when we went to the International Hotel and we paged him, we didn't see him. And then we looked up when we saw him run out of the casino, and he got into a Cadillac and he drove from the area. So the informant and I went over to his house later on that day and knocked on the door, and he let us in his house, and he told us that some guy in the casino told him that the police was in there looking for him, and we asked him, well, how did you think, why would you think that? He said, well, say, when I was in the bathroom, I was doing a line with the little dude in there. We did a couple of lines, and I even gave some of the away, say, but somebody paged me, charged Sonny Liston. Said nobody in the world but the police called me. Yeah, but then we went to his house, and he didn't have any. He told me about the time he'd come from Los Angeles. He scored some coke, and he's on his way back on Highway 15 doing 85 miles per hour, and he had the Nevada Highway Patrol pull up behind him, and he had the coke underneath the seat. And he took the rubber contraceptives and put it in his left hand and thumbed it and broke them all and let them blow back in the wind. And according to him, when he finally pulled over and stopped, it appeared as though it had snowed on the patrolman's car. But he said the patrolman recognized him and told him to slow it down. And he said that he was a good ninja, and that everybody believed that he was a good ninja. And the N-word, so it was okay there. I was supposed to go back to do a deal with him when he was found dead of an overdose. And I'm convinced that he got a hot shot, because when I was negotiating with him, he was,
What were you going to buy?
I was going to buy a couple of ounces of cocaine. And he told me, this was in the 70s, I'm trying to think, 71 or 72, maybe been 73. But he was telling me that there was a golf course located behind his house. He lived on Ottawa Way, then Las Vegas, and that was a telephone post where he kept his stash. He had a hole there next to the telephone post. And he also said that how afraid he was of needles. He said, I'm a big mother effer, and those needles just make me buckle. So from that, I'm sure that he would not shoot himself with a needle, because there are a lot, and from my experience as a medic in the service, a lot of guys who are afraid of needles sometimes faint just at the sight of a needle coming close to their vein.
He wouldn't have all of a sudden, hey, I'm going to shoot up tonight.
If he had snorted it, then that would have told me different, but he was giving it to it in the vein.
He had mentioned to you he was scared of needles.
Exactly, and that's why I'm sure he was hot-shotted.
Okay, take us to that. Give us, so you were working kind of the black celebrities. You did Ike Turner. So talk about this. What's interesting to me is, so this late 60s, early 70s, you have something positive going on. You have, black people asserting themselves, hey, we want to be CEOs, we want to work for the government, we want to be successful. But that also translates into the underworld, where the black criminals are saying, well, I don't just want to work for the mafia. So we want to be Frank Matthews, Frank Lucas, Nicky Barnes, Superfly. So what was that? Did you see that the black criminals kind of trying to get more power than they used to have? Tell us about the age of Superfly, and did you work any of those well-known characters?
Yeah, well, when I was in Detroit, I worked a lot of cases, guys who had the mindset of Superfly. They dressed like Superfly, and they were major drug traffickers. In my book, I mentioned a guy, Tyrone. I called him Mountain, but his true name was Tyrone Fountain. And I talk about how this guy went out. I went to buy heroin from him. He went out. He had about 15 people inside of his house to buy heroin, and I was the shortest on the bottom of the pecking order. When the number reached a certain number, probably 20 or 25, he went off to the stash and came back with a shopping bag full of heroin. Then I mentioned to him, I asked him if he could do a kilo of heroin. And he got indignant. He said, what did you think I just brought in? He said, you're some kind of crazy fool, What do you think I just brought in? But he was a guy, a lot of these guys were sleepers. There was one guy in Los Angeles called Eddie Robinson. And we got a call out of Philadelphia that he was a source of supply of a major heroin cocaine dealer in Philadelphia, black guy living up in Altadena, California. And not many blacks lived in Altadena at that time. Right, because it was a kind of upscale neighborhood. The houses were out of purchasing for a lot of people, and not only that, but it was, and they had, you know, all kind of racial restrictions up in Altadena at that time. But when the undercover agent came in out of Philadelphia, and he set up for 2 kilograms of heroin at the hotel out at the LA International Airport. So we surveilled it, and we thought it was a joke that a black guy was going to deliver 2 kilograms of heroin to a guy out of Philadelphia. I mean, this was, and he was not in our indices. And the LAPD Sheriff's Office, State Bureau of Narcotics, none of them knew of this guy. So we see this big Cadillac drive up, and this guy jumps out like Superfly, he and another guy, and they dressed like Superfly.
Dope in his hand.
No, but he goes up to the room and he finds out that the guy's there, he has the money. Then all of a sudden, one of the guys come down, and here's this beautiful blonde. We see a Mexican, 2 Mexicans pull up in a car, and we see a blonde that comes down from the room and meet with the Mexican. Then she goes upstairs and she delivers the 2 kilograms of heroin to the guys up in the room. And so we caved the door in and bust them, all 5 of them. And then we bust the Hispanic guy, to both of them. And when we went to court that arraigned them that day, the magistrate released them, so we rearrested them. And the main guy was Alfonso Padilla. And we had done background information, which seemed that he made a number of trips coming into the U.S. port of entry through Calexico. And so what we did, we finally indicted him, and we had one of the guys we arrested. Once he went to jail, he was down at Terminal Island, so I went down to Terminal Island and converted him over to a government witness. And he was telling us about Alfonso Padilla, so we ordered up 5 kilograms of heroin. And the guy, Eddie Robinson, he was dealing, putting deals together while he was in prison. But what he was doing, he had worked himself up to the orderlies, the warden's orderly, and he was putting together deals while in prison. And so his partner got irritated. So as a consequence, he decided to cooperate, and we ordered 5 kilograms of heroin. And the connection said they would deliver it in Brawley, California. So we drove over there to Brawley, California, and we set up in the hotel there. I had a female agent and another agent, and we were in the room next door, and here a guy drives up, and he delivers the 5 kilograms of heroin. And at the time, this was a large, and it was brown heroin. They were arrested. And we made a major conspiracy out of that case. That case was one of 6 cases that was given to the Attorney General when Carter was sworn in as president. I was back in Baltimore testifying in that case, Alfonso Padilla et al. And they were the source of supply. The 2 black guys, Eddie Robinson and another guy, they were a source of supply for people in Charlie Berman and and his crew in the Baltimore, Washington, D.C. area, another guy in Washington, D.C., and Joseph and Julia Walker down in the Miami area.
So in that early 70s period, you saw a lot of black dealers figure out how to make their own contacts with
Exactly.
Southeast Asians, whatever, and cut out the mafia.
Exactly.
Can you say that?
Yeah, well, a lot of the black dealers then started going directly to the source. They cut off the middleman. And one of the reasons for it is that a lot of times when they would get the drugs, if they were buying 2 kilograms of heroin, expecting it to be anywhere between 80 and 100% pure, they would end up with 2 kilograms at somewhat 45 or 50% impurity. So they realized that they can make more money going directly to the dealer. They could get it less. Many of the dealers would go down to Tijuana, Rosarito Beach, Calexico, and the dealers would put the heroin over on the U.S. side of the border. They would have a drop car put in a location. The Logan Heights area of San Diego was a typical drop location. A lot of times the police could just drive through the neighborhood and see cars parked and determine that they were load cars.
Oh, wow.
And the traffickers became very astute with their operation, in the sense that what they would do sometimes, they would send a car with a small amount of drugs and let the police seize that and let the big load car come through. And we saw large amounts of marijuana being
Was all this new, or all this wealth that these black dealers were grabbing, was that having an impact on the black community, or were they just blowing it, or what?
it had a debilitating impact on the black community, because the users were committing offenses to get the drugs, where the medicine men, the dealers, medicine men and neighborhood pharmacists, they were getting the money, and they were spending their money on jewelry. They made the tailors, the car dealers, and the attorneys rich, and the bail bondsmen. And in the end, the neighborhoods began to suffer tremendously because of the crimes that were being committed in the neighborhood. And the attorneys were getting rich for defending the jewelry store, the tailoring, and all of that. And I think the most debilitating part of it dealt with, again, I talked about the SNAP cards, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program cards, food stamp card being used as money in this economy, where and only 50 to 60 cents per dollar value, that some of the families who, instead of feeding their kids with these programs, they were buying drugs.
In a lot of these shows or documentaries where you'll get people interviewed and they'll be asking them about a drug pain, and they'll say, oh, well, so-and-so, if he hadn't sold drugs, he could have been a CEO, he was so smart, blah, blah, blah. Do you think that that's true, or these guys are just sort of like bank robbers? If you're willing to sell drugs, it's not hard to make money for a while. Or did you find them to be sophisticated, or not really, or a mixed bag?
I think they were a mixed bag. Many of them were sophisticated. I think had they given an opportunity to deal with money, to handle certain commodities, and the way they did it, how they were able to expand, how they were able to globalize. An example of how Atkins and those guys were able to go to Bangkok and get heroin sent over by military aircraft, and how they were able to send drugs overseas to other areas. A lot of the traffickers, sometimes we had people in the neighborhoods were buying drugs, and sometimes we had people who would fly in from overseas to buy drugs. And then there were a lot of traffickers who ended up, there's some, they call them rich white boys, who were in the marijuana trafficking business. When I ran DEA office out in San Bernardino at Norton Air Force Base, we had a lot of the guys had these DC-3s, white guys. They'd go down to Mexico and bring in loads, ton quantities of marijuana, and they would land on dry lake beds or unoccupied airports like Flabob and places. When they would land in the desert up around Adelanto in these dry lake beds, they would have a camper on one end and a camper on the other end, and they would have the CB radio, they would call, where they would do a circle and the campers would light up. Those are lights on high beam and would give them a runway. They would go in and land and off their load, and then would take off. So a lot of these guys, they made a lot of money and some went legit. That was one thing I can say. And there was one guy, I won't call his name, said his first name was Roger, but he supposedly quit the dope business and went into a legitimate business, and now he has a legitimate business that is all over the United States.
Oh, that you know about,
Yes.
but you can't say.
Right, I wouldn't say,
Tell us about, didn't you work in Bolivia?
yes, I did.
Tell us, what year were you in Bolivia?
I was there when I was deputy chief of the cocaine investigation section, and that would have been in '88. At that time.
Bolivia was a source country. What were you, tell us about, you know about Roberto Suarez? And
Right. Bolivia was a source country. What we did, one of the U.S. agencies determined there were a number of clandestine cocaine producing laboratories in Bolivia. And we had them pinpointed. And what we did was we arranged a program called SNOWCAP, and SNOWCAP was an effort utilizing the U.S. military and DEA and the Bolivian UMAPA police to locate these labs and destroy them in the thick canopy jungles of Bolivia. And when I first went there, we flew in there to San Jose. I want to think San Jose. Not Joe Swanee, and went into the airport there, and I saw the largest U.S. aircraft I'd ever seen in my life came in there, a C-5A landed. When I looked up, saw it landing at this airport, I almost fainted. I didn't think we had a plane so big. And the front of the nose of it raised up, and the tail let out, and when they pulled out 6 Black Hawk helicopters and put the rotors on, and they flew them over to a base camp, and we started operation that day.
So that was when the war on drugs got serious.
Well, we did this. This was the first time we'd ever used U.S. forces in that type of assistance. We had used them in other assistance domestically when we would destroy domestic marijuana in forests and places like that. We used them on a whack and stack basis. But in Bolivia, I had the chief, and I and the other deputy chief, we wanted to get 2 helicopters and to be able to hit a lab per day. We had like 46 labs. We had locations in the thick canopy jungles of Bolivia that we wanted to destroy. And we thought maybe they would send us, like 2 helicopters and maybe 12 men, 2 pilots, 4 pilots, and a crew. And we ended up with 200 soldiers over there.
It was a real military.
Yeah, and it was shocking to me because that's all we had. They even had medics and all of that. But what happened, I went out on one of the raids one day. It was kind of funny. I noticed that the Bolivian police, the UMAPA, they had the old M1 rifles that were obsolete from the U.S. arsenal. And some of them had 4 or 5 bullets, and they didn't have the case,
Did you think the Bolivians were corrupt or not really?
No, I didn't. They had the bullets in their pockets, and stuff like that, and they had a web belt, and they looked like almost like Pancho Villa soldiers, kind of ragtag. And we went down through this jungle, and we ran into a little location where some chicken came out of, apparently it was a squatter's location. Chicken ran out, and one of the soldiers grabbed the chicken. He chased the chicken all the way down through the thick canopy jungle, and he came back with the chicken. He had it strapped to his belt.
Take it home for dinner.
He was walking, and the chicken was flopping left to right. And I'm thinking to myself, what the hell kind of operation is this?
That was his dinner.
And it was his dinner, but we got there and we found the lab, and it had been evacuated. The operators had left, so we destroyed it. It was dynamited, and
If the U.S. government hadn't gotten involved militarily in destroying stuff in Colombia and Bolivia and Peru with the cocaine trade what would have gone on if there hadn't been a military intervention?
I think it would have increased the drug trade. Even today is out of control. I think we had, even when Bush was the vice president, George Bush, we had an operation, South Florida Task Force. And what we were doing in that operation, we were seizing ships, boarding ships that were laden with contraband en route to the United States. And the ships that would not stop and be searched, we would sink them they would sink them right there on the spot. When I was in Puerto Rico, we had what is called the GANTSEC, Greater Antilles Coast Guard Section. And we had some equipment there where we could determine certain ships traveling to the United States that were laden, drug laden. And in that, we would get that information, and then it would be sanitized, and we would, the Coast Guard would go out and they would intercept the ship. In other words, if we knew a ship was sailing at this latitude, longitude, at so many knots, then the Coast Guard would tell one of the cutters to sail that.
Well, that's a good segue, because you guys, the government, was very effective when all that attention got placed on South Florida and the Bahamas. That's when Mexico became, they call it the Mexico
A very major transshipment point.
Talk about Mexico, how it kind of took over as the
Transshipment point. One of the things that Mexico did was like the borders. One of the worst things we have is, no, I take that back. I won't say worst thing, but we have NAFTA, which provided easy access for commercial vehicles to come into the United States and vice versa, bringing in the products of the United States going into Mexico and Canada, vice versa. And we had an influx of marijuana and cocaine and stuff being brought into the United States on false-bedded tankers. These tankers, they would have cocaine in certain sections and marijuana in certain sections. So when you would go up above and you would put a device down to the bottom, it would be only one section that the device would measure. And if you went to 3 sections, those sections were hollowed out to give you a false sense that you were at the bottom. There was nothing at the other, in the tanker. But at that point, and we had an operation off of Colombia, and we have Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, and Peru are major sources for cocaine. And now Colombia is also a major source for heroin and marijuana. And we have in Peru, we have what is called the Upper Huallaga Valley, which is one of the most fertile areas of the world. And the farmers there can raise 2 crops per year. It has ideal soil, ideal weather conditions for farming. We had an operation there where we were using the military to give us information on planes that were departing those 3 countries flying to the United States. And then we would have them intercepted once they came into the United States. And one of the congressmen, I won't call his name, that he was briefed, and before we got really going with the operation, he disclosed the operation. It was called Operation Hat Trick.
He disclosed it to who?
He disclosed it in a press conference, and it shot it, and crooks are not as stupid. They have intelligence bases just like we do. And so they basically changed their operation. What they're doing now, they have these drones. They're shipping drugs by drones. They even have submarines. Sometimes we think the old way of doing business is the way they are going to continue, but they don't. They have drones, they have planes, they have, again, they use various ruses. One where they would send a load car, to occupy the intercepting agency, and then send a big shipment later. And while everybody's taking pictures and doing the big press release, and then the bulk of it is coming in.
Do you think, you express you don't think marijuana should be legal, so I guess you don't think drugs should be legalized, but you're also saying that it's basically unstoppable. So what do you think the right balance of policy is?
I'm not saying it's unstoppable. When I was on the cocaine desk, I met a PhD from Montana State University who had developed a fungus called Fusarium oxysporum, and that fungus introduced into a farming area would prevent the production of any coca or marijuana from being produced for 6 years.
But it wouldn't impact other crops?
It would impact other crops, but this was something we had broached the State Department with, and they didn't want to go with it because they were thinking. And then there was another thing you've probably seen if you've been down south, kudzu.
I've heard of it.
Kudzu is a vine. It grows on the wires all over the place. Kudzu takes over a crop. You could introduce kudzu there, and kudzu would take over the growing area.
But it would also destroy the farmers.
Exactly. So that was one of the reason why it wasn't done.
Let's go back to L.A. Talk about how the black gangs, the Bloods and the Crips, grew from just these little street gangs to when the rise of the cocaine era in the 80s, and did these guys have direct contacts with Colombians, and how they spread? Because you were in St. Louis, they got a big drug problem, how these guys, because of drugs, they were able to spread across the country.
Well, because of drugs, many of them started right there in Compton in South Central Los Angeles. South Central Los Angeles is that area east of Crenshaw and south of Pico, all the way down to Compton, and they call that South Central. Included in that is part of Watts, which starts at about 100th century all the way down to about 108th. And from Central all the way over to Alameda. But we have a lot of the druggists. Again, they decided to, gangs, shortly after the Watts riot, let me go back a little bit, the government put in programs to give youth something to do. We had a county director by the name of Kenneth Hahn in Los Angeles, and he had the South Central area. And he realized that there was nothing for the young youth to do, so he set up a lot of programs. He even set up a program that dealt with the building of the Charles Drew Hospital there in South Central, which is actually in Willowbrook, California. Prior to that time, none of the politicians had done anything in that community, but Kenneth Hahn did. And so the young youth, they started selling drugs because there were no jobs, and nobody gave a heck about them. So, and even when people had to go to a general hospital, they had to drive all the way from Compton, South Central, all the way up to East Los Angeles, to the Los Angeles General Hospital. And so they put in, he helped build, it's called the Charles Drew Hospital, located on 120th in Wilmington, right down the street from, I mentioned, the front where all of the heroin guys used to be. But the young guys started, they realized that no jobs, and many of them came from communities where the eroded family life. Many of them came from matriarchal ruled families, you know. Some didn't even know their dads, and some's dad was in prison. And as a result, there were only like approximately 35% of blacks in that area. And in the United States today, where there's a two-parent household, father and mother there. So what they started doing, they had, there were a lot of black businesses. They had a place called Golden Bird, which is a chicken place better than Kentucky Fried Chicken. But now the Hispanics have gone in there with Pollo Loco, and they run them out of business. But the blacks started buying dope, going down to Mexico, finding a connection, buying dope and selling it. They were making a lot of money. And then they started venturing out. They stopped waiting on the Connect to drive up and overcharge them. The Connect to come from Colombia, drive up and overcharge them. So they developed their own connect in Mexico, in Colombia and places. And a lot of times they would use transshipment locations. For instance, they would go to places like the Bahamas, and from the Bahamas go down to Miami and have the drugs sent from Miami, flown into, the cocaine flown into, brought into Miami area. And then some would even ship it over to the west coast of Florida, over on the Gulf of Mexico part.
Louisiana, that came in.
Right, and what they would do, these guys, they were selling drugs, and they started getting customers all over the place. It's like in the other.
Did you see when you were in St. Louis, did you see LA gang members there?
Oh yes, we had an organization there, a black organization, called Jerry Lewis Bay, the Moorish Science Temple, and they were drug dealers. They were so bad they charged the Crips and the Blood a fee to deal drugs there in the St. Louis area. And one.
I didn't know they were charging the Crips and the Blood.
They were bad. As a matter of fact, I went to one of the trials there, and we had an informant there testifying, and one of the attorneys, it was against one of the guys in the Jerry Lewis Bay organization, and the defense attorney said, "Isn't it true, Mr. So-and-so, that you shot so-and-so's eyes outside of his head up against the wall?" And the government witness, Your Honor, said, that's hard to answer. So the judge said, well, answer that, son, the best way you can. He said, Your Honor, I did shoot him in the head. I don't know where his eyes went, or if they went anywhere. But he was part of that organization. But they went to all cities all over the United States, to every place where there was a major black population. Ironically, in my undercover work, I went up to Salt Lake City. And when I went up to Salt Lake City, I had gone up to Salt Lake City when I was in college playing football at Compton College, and we flew up there. No, that was Idaho, but went up to Salt Lake City, and I learned that there were only like 250 blacks in the whole town of Salt Lake City at the time. And I worked undercover up there and found out that it was the blacks that had all of the heroin up there in Salt Lake City. And I went into a place there in Salt Lake City that was like a shit house. We had about 20 people inside of there, and it was a shooting gallery. And there were a couple of guys on the sofa and on the nod. One guy, you could see blood dripping out of his arm. And we had and people coming in, buying the stuff and shooting up right there in the house. And some would go in the nod, some would go out. But in Salt Lake City, there were three guys, Lorenzo Hubbard, Charles Joshua, and Billy Charles Harris. They had the monopoly of heroin up in Salt Lake City during that time. But the gangs started going all over the United States, all the way up into Connecticut in places, selling drugs.
Because they had access to cheap cocaine in LA.
Exactly, cocaine and heroin up in LA. You know, the ironic thing right now, we are in denial that there are a lot of white Americans from upscale families addicted to heroin. And I'm not saying a handful is not an aberration. There are
Thousands,
hundreds of thousands. And heroin in a lot of the upscale suburban neighborhoods is a drug of choice. Many people say, well, you know, we just smoke this marijuana, and marijuana is not a bad drug. And we said, well, you know, we take this cocaine. While in St. Louis, I would just say that going back, I was a very rich guy that had a young lady overdosed in his house in St. Louis. And as a matter of fact, he was one of the Anheuser-Busch heirs. And there was some indication that there was a lot of cocaine in that location, but nothing ever went beyond that. And sometimes when a person overdosed, if you gave that person the drugs, you could be charged with manslaughter.
clean it up.
Right. But sometimes what happened is that In the black neighborhood, when a person overdoses, just another person gone, you know, another asshole gone. Like my days in Detroit, my first trip there, when I saw the two bodies in the trunk of the car, and the law enforcement, the Wayne County Sheriff said, you know, instead of just two other assholes, and it's behind a lot of.
Too, like oxycontin.
Pardon?
That said, the legal drugs like oxycontin are the biggest problem.
All over the place. And not only that, but they're mixing them with fentanyl and other drugs. You have designer drugs out there. I was in a little town in Mississippi, Cleveland, Mississippi, and I thought that the biggest thing in Cleveland, Mississippi, was a McDonald's restaurant, but they had gangs over there dealing drugs. And I read a police report that was shocking to me, and it showed how cavalier the shooters in these gangs were. The report basically read that this guy was sitting at home and his buddy called him and said, hey, what are you doing? He said, nothing. He said, hey, we're going to come by and get you. He said, okay. They went by and they picked him up and said they smoked a joint. But when he first got in the car, the driver said, hey, man, do you know where a lick is? And, you know, hitting a lick means committing a robbery. The guy said, no, not right now. He said, well, I need to hit a lick to put some money in my pocket. So they went and got some marijuana. They smoked the marijuana. And they drove over to a housing area. And they saw the dope car pull up in there. And they decided to hit the dope car. And when the driver got out, and the driver's brother thought he was down in the car, he came down to the car. And while they were rifling through the car, the guy looked up and saw the brother, and he shot the brother. The brother took off and ran over behind a dumpster. And so the guy who's testifying, he said, you know, he gave him 3 pop, 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 pop. And he said the ninja ran over behind that dumpster over there, and I heard him give him 3 more, pop, pop, pop. So when he came back, he said, I think I killed that ninja. And he said, really? He said, let's wait around until the 5-0 come by. So we'll see if he's dead. And he said, I want to see if it's a cousin of mine, I'm going to have to kill one of your cousins. And this is how cavalier the gangs are talking, like he's not going to kill the shooter, but he's going to kill one of his cousins just to avenge the. But you know, in Los Angeles, and many of the cities and states, major cities, the biggest problem are the gangs, and the gangs dealing drugs. And they kill one another because of flying colors. You know, the Bloods would kill a Crip if they see a Crip flying wearing blue, and vice versa. And you have innocent people killed. And guns are all over the place. And killing people is part of the drug trade. You know, they send a message that if you snitch, if they suspect that you're the snitch, they kill you. If you don't pay for drugs, they kill you.
So over your career, you saw, you know, the federal prison population probably quintupled or something. You know, a lot of it was young black males. And I guess I asked you this question earlier, but I ask you again. So to slow down the drugs, you put millions of people in prison and, you know, cause them a problem in life, it's hard to get a job, felony, or some of them don't ever get out, blah, blah, blah. Is the drugs are bad, but is the war on drugs worse?
I think the war on drugs is not as much as it should be. Going back to that, you mentioned the president is letting out, has issued an order to let out, and many states are looking at releasing a lot of prisoners who are in for crack cocaine. Ironically, I was part of a Department of DEA delegation to meet with Department of Justice officials and Senator Lawton Childs when he came up from Florida and brought up 40 sheriffs from Florida explaining the crack cocaine problem and the information that, pardon, this would have been in the about 78 or 79. he was talking about the problem they were having there in Florida. And we met with one of the deputy assistant attorney generals in the main justice there. And they were drafting up the law to make the crack cocaine penalties harsher. You know, the theory behind that is that even then, when crack first hit the street, we saw the debilitating effect it had upon the people. It was highly addictive. In addition to that, we saw young ladies do a thing called clucking. They would stay outside of crack houses and perform all kinds of sexual acts just to go in to get a rock. And once they smoke that rock and the euphoric effect wears off, they go back outside and engage in that sort of behavior again for another rock. We saw mothers abandon their kids. We saw kids, I saw kids who were born mothers who were crack addicts, and how the impact that it had on babies, just as heroin, excuse me, just as heroin, the impact on heroin on babies. A baby born of a heroin addict is a heroin addict, and that, as you're aware, that's how the Jones-Miller Act came into being, that being a heroin addict is not a crime because a baby cannot be born committing a felony, a crime. But,
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah, but you had the crack, the debilitating effect that crack has on the community. And we have crack addicts who commit very violent crimes. It's similar to the ones that the heroin addicts commit. Crack addicts, I think, historically, and I think there are documents to prove that they are equal or more violent than a heroin addict. They commit, usually a heroin addict will commit crimes against property, thefts, and that sort of thing, while we have cracks would commit all kinds of crimes against property and persons. And usually the crime against persons are very bizarre crimes, and not just slapping a person, but cutting a person's head off, doing things that are almost inhuman to a person.
Didn't the rise, right when we talked earlier about the Iran-Contra, or the cocaine and the Contras, right around that time is when the price of cocaine dropped
Right.
tremendously, and that's when you saw crack. Was there a correlation between what Oliver North and Reagan was doing and the rise of crack cocaine?
I think we saw I'm surprised that it dropped because crack cocaine is more pure generally than the powder.
The prices got really cheap.
But what they would do, they would mix it with baking soda when they would rock it up and water, swirl it around. We had, during the Jimmy Carter administration, we saw a proliferation of cocaine. We had, prior to that time, had probably maybe a meal upon 5 people using cocaine. And Jimmy Carter had a White House advisor by the name of Dr. Peter Bourne, who stated that cocaine was harmless. It should only be a recreational drug. And at that time, we saw an increase of about 8.5 million people using cocaine. Cocaine skyrocketed. But back to the black community went to the crack because it was cheaper. You know, you could buy a $5, $10 rock. Now they may be $50. And then it was, but they didn't realize that it was how addictive it is and how it causes the urge to continue to smoke it. Similar to like heroin, sometimes a heroin addict, once he shoots up and goes on the nod, and until the urge comes back, it could be another 8 or 12 hours. But with the crack addict, once that euphoria goes off, they want it right away. And I think that even now, almost every city with a population of 5,000 or more have drug dealers, drug users. They have medicine men in the neighborhood, and this is why the crime is out of control. We mentioned Colorado legalized marijuana, and I was about to say that. They found that the vehicle homicide rate has increased by 40-something% for people under the influence of marijuana. They found that they indicate that it has it brings in income for the state of Colorado, which it does, but it has tremendous debilitating effect upon the public. And they don't realize that one of the things that marijuana does, marijuana is a hallucinogenic drug. It has properties, a lot of cancerous properties. In addition to that, it has a tendency with the smokers to lose all of their inhibition, to lose their ability to excel, to feel complacent, and not to be productive. And it shows that even when you watch athletes, and there's a proof that those who use marijuana cannot sustain certain levels of pain. There's certain chemicals in the brain, I think one is called dopamine, that allows the body to sustain certain levels of pain. And I think the marijuana users, once they start using it, the athletes, they cannot, especially in games like football or physical.
I don't know.
Yeah.
All right, let's do one more topic, and then I'll let you go. Let's just talk about, I know you did work in Mexico. Let's talk about your early undercover work in Mexico, if you knew anything about the Kiki Camarena case, and what your thoughts about corruption and the cartels today.
Now, ironic, the Kiki Camarena, I encouraged him to become a DEA agent while working undercover down in Calexico.
Oh, you met him?
I encouraged him to, I was undercover and on a deal that he pulled surveillance.
What was he then?
He was a sheriff officer on the Imperial County Sheriff Office. And he came and asked me a lot of questions about it, and I told him, hey, put in your application. And he was hired.
So he was you liked him, he was good?
He was a heck of a nice guy, bilingual. And he went down to Mexico, and I think he was in Guadalajara. He was abducted. And one of my...
It was a big raid on a marijuana ranch.
Right, and the name escapes me, the marijuana guy. Arellano Felix, right, Felix Arellano, right.
Felix Arellano.
And as a matter of fact, just got out of jail.
Yep, and then he went into hiding.
Right. But it was, the corruption, what happened was that there was people...
What cases did you work, like, tell us about you worked there early what years were you there undercover?
In Mexico?
Yeah.
It was early in the 69 up through 79, 10 years.
Oh, you were in Mexico 10 years?
No, I was in Los Angeles, but I went down.
I mean, you did work in Mexico.
Oh, yes,
for 10
yes.
years.
Yeah, sporadically.
Tell us about the corruption and between the drug dealers and the police and the government.
One case I explained in my book, it was undercover on a guy by the name of Pablo Yvalles. And we was inside of his house negotiating for several tons of marijuana. I and a U.S. custom agent, both undercover, and we had him. And his house was an opulent house at that time. This was down in the 70s, early 70s.
Tijuana?
Yeah. And he had the first refrigerator that I saw. I hadn't seen one where you could put a glass and ice would come out and water would come out. And he had sesame seed cookies, and he had lobster, chunks of lobster that you dip in a sauce. And I was just impressed as how lush. But anyway, this guy, while inside of the house, we had a custom agent was out front on surveillance, and we had an informant ran out of that. I didn't know it was an informant at the time. He ran out of the house, and he came back in. He said, and he told Pablo, said, there's some suspicious guys out there, and he took a gun. He said, I'm gonna go out and identify himself. And I knew that if he went outside and contact this particular custom agent, that he was going to get blasted. And we were working with a guy, a Mexican fed out of Mexico City by the name of Raul, by name of Esponda. And so he came back in the house. He said, yes, there's a guy. I said, I think he's the police, because I saw there's a little light in the glove compartment that indicated he might have a radio. And so Pablo said, wait just a minute. And so he said, wait a second. So he called the police. I called the police. He called the police, and we went out on the veranda, and we watched the police come up in the van, towed the agent and vehicle away. And needless to say, after the arrest, the policeman got a good A-whipping by the Mexican Fed. But that was the sort of thing that happened. And I was there one time when we had an agent go into a major drug trafficker, and one of the Mexican Feds said he wanted to leave, call his wife, and he left. And while the agent was undercover in the house, he called and told the crook that there was an agent in his house. And luckily the agent didn't get killed. But corruption was very, very widespread there.
Didn't they find out? They found out about Camarena being undercover from
corrupt Mexican Fed. That's right.
What was, so you were in a DEA at that time. I know that was a big, I mean, you guys really like declared war on the Mexican cartel. Talk about when you got the call that Camarena was dead and how big of a deal that was.
It was a very big deal. It was frightening in the sense that not many people realized what they did was they impaled him. They took a rod and impaled him with the rod. And one of the saddest things was that when I was in Puerto Rico, there was a high Mexican official came to Puerto Rico, and our country attaché brought him over to what they call an executive visit. And so the chief of police and I and the head of the FBI, we took the guy to one of the swank restaurant, Casa Brava there in San Juan, romanced him and took him to the casino and just gave him a royal treatment and briefed him about everything. And he was one of the guys involved in that. And it really hurt me when I found out.
Kiki Camarena?
Exactly, yes. And he was subsequently indicted. In that case, there was a joint case between DEA and the FBI. And one of the things that happened was probably the first time they had used hypnosis to solve that case. Hypnosis was used to solve the case, but on one of the witnesses. Yeah, but it was the corruption was very widespread. As an attestation to the corruption is how Chapo in prison, in one of the most maximum security prison there in Mexico, was able to escape. I mentioned the $22 billion seized from his house. And there's indication that there are 28 houses like his. He had his own private zoo. He had a white tiger. He had firearms and all kinds of stuff.
And all this would have only been possible if he was closely working with high government officials.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, if you were, not open yet, no bar yet. Holiday weekend. If you were special advisor to the president, put in charge of law enforcement to deal with the drug problem in the U.S., talk about what you think about legalization, treatment, imprisonment. I mean, all these guys that have been sent away for 20 years that are filling up the streets, what are they supposed to do now?
Well, actually, I think our criminal justice system is a failure when it comes to correction and rehabilitation, in the sense that we used to, when a person went to jail, we used to have them develop a trade, send them through a battery of training, anger management, drug, all of that sort of thing, and behavior modification courses and witness impact, all of that. We don't do that anymore. And so once they would come out with the trade, some of the trades they were learning were like trades where they can get a job, like shoe cobbling, drywall, and brick masonry, and that sort of thing. They don't have those anymore. But I would have more intense efforts in using the military against the drug trade. I would pressure these countries like Mexico. Anytime you seize one house with $22 billion in it, and there are 28 more in Mexico alone, probably with more money than that if he has $22 billion, and this is money that he has amassed, you can think about the amount of money that he has expended. When you look at, he has a private zoo, all of the gold guns and stuff, and you have other traffickers with that much richness. When you look at the amount of money leaving the United States, untaxed money, billions of dollars, you know, the drug traffic is affecting the United States in multi-trillions of dollars per year. And while even our politicians, they kind of step wide of it, they put people in place like these Phi Beta Kappa guys to run agencies that don't know how to really get in there, get their hands wet, and make a meaningful impact on the drugs. They're just figureheads. It's like the guy in charge of DEA now. Excuse me. I don't think he's doing nearly enough. We should be in countries, even when I was in Los Angeles, we had crop eradication programs with Mexico, where we would go in and we would spray herbicides with the Mexican government. And we started that with Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru. We had a general over there, Zarate was his name, who was one of the best generals, anti-narcotic generals out there. But as things have changed with the administration, all of this, we've lost that. My first trip to Bogota was when Jaime Ramirez, the chief narcotic guy, was killed. When I got off the plane, I saw so many policemen, it frightened me. I saw policemen on a horseback. Then when I went into the embassy and we interviewed, how he was killed was, he was given up by one of his officers. He went to a retreat on a day like today, and he was coming back with his family. Only one officer knew where he had gone and when he would be back. And a guy on a motorcycle, and this is what his wife said, drove up next to him and sprayed the side of the car, veered off to the side. He drove up nonchalantly with the Uzi and sprayed him several times, and his wife said, please don't hurt us. He got back on and he didn't have a mask or anything. He got back on the motorcycle and drove away like he'd issued a traffic ticket.
So people clearly like to use drugs for whatever reason. So what's between putting people in prison and stopping drug use, or should we, like alcohol, should we say, well, if you choose to damage your life with drugs as long as you don't hurt anybody else, or where does that balance lie between incarceration and, you know, people's right to do what they want to do, or are drugs so, can you make a distinction between beer is okay, vodka's okay, marijuana's bad, heroin's worse, you know?
I would say that drugs, I would be against the legalization of marijuana, and one of the reasons is that even though historically people say the drug is a graduate to a different drug, some people say, well, I've been smoking marijuana all my life. It's not the case. There's historical data that they do graduate to a more dangerous drug. There's historical data that it does debilitate the mental prowess of people. It takes out their ambition.
Alcohol?
Alcohol does the same. The difference is that alcohol, right after, about several years ago, there were 50,000 people in the United States dying from alcohol accidents on the highways, okay? And the difference is that, like, right now, there are not many ways to detect when a person is under the influence of marijuana. And so, an example, we just had 2 pilots that were arrested. They were getting ready to fly. This happened 2 days ago. We know that marijuana causes depth deceptions and hallucinations. And I would hate to be on a plane where a guy is flying under the influence of marijuana or under the influence of cocaine. A lot of people haven't seen the idiosyncrasies that other people suffer from cocaine and marijuana. Some people they become schizophrenic. They start ducking and they start seeing things that are not there, looking up in the sky. And that is one reason. I think I think what we made a mistake as it involves medicinal purposes, I would be for it for medicinal purposes if it was like how we do an opiate. We have it in a lab under controlled conditions, and we have it tested by FDA. You know, there's certain doses, and we have certain precautions that if you take an example, if you take too many ibuprofen, say 3,000, so many of them a month, it could take your kidney out or liver and stuff like that. But the way it is now for recreational, nobody's saying anything about the adverse effect it would have on the mind. Not only that, but what they're doing is criminalizing it. They're letting criminals grow it. You know, why not do, when I was in St. Louis, there's a major pharmaceutical company there. I went and saw 2 tons of opium brought in to the United States to be converted. No, converted for medicine. And I watched how it was brought in and the precautionary measures, how it was stored, and all of that. So I mentioned that to say that if you're going to have marijuana as a legal medicinal purpose, why not put it in a mist, put it in a pill, rather than having them smoke it? You know, it's almost like alcohol. You know, when they legalize alcohol, they don't want you out there making it in the still. Okay, they want it under controlled conditions. So to legalize it for medicinal purpose, I have no problem with that.
Oh, and then the final thing, well, and this ties in what you're talking about. Well, speaking of legal opioids, I mean that's the single. I mean, overdosing on prescribed pills kills more people than heroin, cocaine, all of it put together every year. So people like to use drugs to get high, and even if they're medicine, they abuse them. I mean, is this going to be a going forward 50, 100, 200 years into the future? How do humans deal with drugs?
Mm-hmm.
As someone who's worked around drugs and seen the negative impacts, I mean, how do some people, maybe you can't answer this, but you know, what is the perils of drugs going into the future?
I would strongly urge a decrease, continue to not legalize the drug, to continue to monitor the drugs, to continue to enforce drug laws. I mentioned this to say that there's some drugs out there that a lot of people are dying. You mentioned people are dying from legitimate opioids. That's not true. There's so many people, so many stars, and people are dying from drugs. When Prince died, I stated before they even came back with the autopsy, that it was either AIDS or it was a drug, a combination of prescribed drugs mixed with an illicit drug, and maybe heroin. But I even think that even they came back to say that it was a prescribed drug but I'm sure he had another drug in his system. A lot of the stars, when they die, you look like Seymour Hoffman dying. You look at River Phoenix. You look at a lot of the people who are dying from these overdoses. They didn't start off, see, I'm gonna use heroin. They started off on marijuana, so they eventually went into it, into the heavier drugs. So that's why I'm against it. And not only that, but I think it's very sad that people who are young, very talented people. Ray Charles was a heroin addict. Okay, Miles Davis, a heroin addict. Eddie Fisher, heroin addict. Bird. You look at Howard Hughes was a dope fiend. You know, I mean, you look at all of these people. Elvis was a dope fiend. Johnny Cash was a dope fiend. You look at all of these people, and we say that, well, you know, that's how they wanted to live. But I think we should have preventative and educational means to prevent this abuse of drugs. I'm strongly against it. And I have arthritis. I take tramadol, which is an opiate. and I have the authorization to take it every 8 hours. I take one in the morning to alleviate the pain, and if I have pain in the evening, if I can't sleep, I'll take another one. Sometimes I only take one a day because, and I don't have an addictive personality. It's just that I do know that there's certain pains that are so severe that people need relief from them. I've had one of my agents in St. Louis committed suicide because he had an accident and the pain was so severe. And he ended up, killing himself.
Because of?
The severe pain, he wasn't able to get relief. And some of the hard drugs like Dilaudid and some of those drugs, major painkillers, do relieve the pain. But I think that as it involves crime, I think that the drugs, whether they're legal or illegal, they are the main driver, catalyst for crime to be as high and bizarre as it's becoming today, without any let up. And I just find it awful when you have, you see teenagers taking families out, because they're under the influence and they want drugs.
All right, and then just to finish up, just so I have it, just say John Sutton, DEA from XX to X.
Give that.
John Sutton, I was, I started in
Okay. My name is John Sutton.
I retired as the head of Black Mafia.
My name is John Sutton. I started my law enforcement career as a police officer in the city of Compton, California. Then I went with the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. I stayed with them for 25 years. I started off as a street agent, became a group supervisor, mid-level manager, an inspector. Then I became a senior executive. I ran the marijuana investigation section in our headquarters. I had the responsibility for the worldwide suppression of cannabis. In addition to that, after that, I left there and went to the St. Louis Field Division as the special agent in charge there, and I retired. I was a senior executive with the agency, and I worked from a street agent all the way up to a senior executive.
This guy telling us our time is up. He sent the demon in.
Did he?